All right. Well, good morning, Belinda.
Good morning, Mosi.
It's been quite an honor to finally put a face with the name in person. I've heard a lot about some of your early leadership with respect to the development of the National Survey of Black Americans. And so, as you know, today we're going to be just kind of reviewing some of that history. And so I think it would be great if we could start just prior to your entry at Michigan. So, what were you doing just before you came here, and what brought you here to the University of Michigan?
I was at the University, I'm sorry, excuse me, I was at the University of Chicago.
Okay.
I was an undergraduate there. I ended up at Chicago because I had some relatives there. I was from a very small town outside of Pittsburgh called Washington, Pennsylvania, pronounced there Washington, Pennsylvania. I wanted a place that was bigger, an urban setting, having two uncles and an aunt there. Chicago seemed safe. It was also a very rigid school environment. The motto at Chicago is where fun goes to die. It was a very small environment, so I had small class sizes. I learned about the University of Michigan during a meeting of the Black Student Psychological Association that took place in Ann Arbor. And I went in 1970, I guess it was, and thought, wow, I think I'd like to go to that university. Roberta Flack gave a very small concert on campus, and I thought things are happening here. There was a political movement here. I learned a bit about the psychology program and how it, at the time, seemed to be embracing, issues related to race and ethnicity. And I thought, this may be the place for me. James had not come yet. He came the same year that I came. So I applied to 10 graduate schools, actually. And Michigan seemed to offer everything that I needed. And it was also not too far from home because my grandmother was ill. So that's how I got here.
Wow. Very interesting, very interesting. And so being kind of lured in by the larger climate of the university, what were some of the things that you were initially kind of interested in studying when you came into graduate school?
I wasn't entirely sure. In fact, when I was recruited, Frank Yates, who was, I think, still maybe even a graduate student or who had just become a faculty member, maybe that was it, tried to get me to go into math psychology. I had good math scores and a lot of math in my background. I looked at some other areas. Social, however, seemed to be integrative. My interest in communities and the contacts together with my interest in individual behavior, everything seemed to come together in social, and the people I found most dynamic seemed to be in social.
Okay. Yeah. So you come and you have a kind of open template, broadly speaking, and you pick social. And at what point did you sort of stumble along and maybe meet James, or how did that whole kind of moment occur?
I first started working for Pat Gurin. I had a little job as a research assistant. It was, my first job in graduate school. I had interesting kinds of jobs in undergraduate school, including working in a high energy physics lab, including doing interviews and coding for NORC, which then was called the National Opinion Research Center. So I'd had, some research experiences, and Pat was just so supportive, and, she praised my work, and I thought, oh my goodness, somebody, was satisfied with my work at least. And I'm not sure if she brought me into another project or somebody else did, but I ended up working on this, what we called the high school project. James was a project director on that study. Elizabeth Duvan worked on it, as did, I think, Joe Veroff. And we were doing research in high schools in Detroit, one high school in particular, Northwestern High School. And that went on for maybe my first 2 years at Michigan. There were a number of people a number of older students working on that project that I became close to. One was Ron Jennings, for example. Another was Laura Head. And I'm not sure how that morphed into, our decision to launch this study, but Joe Veroff had been, the principal investigator, or one of the principal investigators on Americans via their mental health, which this study, what became, the National Survey of Black Americans, was modeled very much on Americans via their mental health. So I don't know who came up with the idea, hey, let's do this with black folks or not, but I was there, very interested in both projects, and I guess we started having conversations.
Right. So now I'm remembering that. So our interview with Phil, he was telling us that you and him were working a lot on other projects, kind of in ISR.
Right. And that high school project was one of them.
Okay.
Right.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so. So you're taking coursework.
Yes.
And you are working as a research assistant on a couple of different projects at ISR, largely with Pat Gurin and others.
Well, and I don't think Pat was involved in that first study, but I did work on that one little project just for her.
Okay.
And then I came into the group project.
Okay.
And group projects, were, the mode of operation here.
Yeah.
Spoiled me probably for the rest of my life, because for the most part, people got along on these projects, people worked together, and students were given very significant roles on every one of these projects. And that was, I think, probably distinctive maybe at the time. The relationships were not nearly as hierarchical as they can be in other places, and maybe even were on other projects. But I remember the team meetings, or working on instrument development, questionnaire development, trying to figure out how we were going to to look at some of these constructs. And that probably that high school project was a good kind of test case for a number of the other things that we did later.
Okay. Yeah, so I hear a lot about this climate in terms of heavy student participation in what are generally kind of leadership roles in the research community. What impact do you think that culture had on your own development?
Well, I think that given that level of responsibility also was indicative of a level of trust that went a long way toward giving you the kind of confidence that you needed to finish the program. When I was here, everybody expected to finish in 4 years. I mean, that was, the mandate, it seemed to be. And if you varied, wow, what's going on, right? Right. So, you never thought that you couldn't do it. Everybody else was doing it.
Right.
And the professors had great confidence. And Pat Gurin has been at UCLA a couple times recently, helping us with, some issues we're dealing with out there.
Okay.
And, we were talking about age, and she said, gosh, I didn't realize you were so much younger. She says, at some point I was thinking of you as a colleague.
Wow.
And, for her to have said that, I thought, goodness, at the time, we really, on some level, felt like children because we were so young. But, all of the professors that we worked with were also pretty young. I mean, James was fresh out of graduate school.
Right.
And you can see from some of the photographs, he was a kid too.
Yeah. Absolutely. And so, please correct me if I say anything that is not correct. And by the way, they can't hear me as well as they can hear you.
Okay.
So, from what I understand, there was a moment where James gets invited to write a proposal, and then the next thing I know about the record is that you're working on the proposal with James.
Yes, and Jerry Gurin.
And Jerry Gurin, because Jerry was the person who invited James to write the proposal.
Right, and he also, he had, the stature, the heft, because of what he had done with Americans via their mental health, I think, to give us entree, I think, at that point. So, a brash young professor, even today, is not going to get that kind of money at NIMH. And it had to have, I think, the stamp of approval by a Jerry Gurin, who was a giant in the field then, to really go forward.
Yeah, absolutely. And so Jerry recognizes the need and sort of sees James at that time as a person that has the motivation and the skill to kind of pull it through. How did you become a co-proposal writer?
I am not exactly sure. I was finishing my dissertation. I think I was a good writer. In fact, on my dissertation, they used to write comments. I don't know if they do that now, but everybody had to write comments, every member of your committee. And then Elizabeth Duvon at the time wrote, she writes better than half the faculty. So I thought, maybe they thought I was a decent writer or something and, could help write it up. Because I'm not exactly sure, how I became one of the 3 co-PIs. I don't know. It's kind of murky at this point, but James was my dissertation chair. Libby was on the committee. Doc Cartwright, I don't know if you remember him, who was, the group dynamics fame, yes. He was also a committee member. So I had a, really great committee.
Wow. So what do you think was your interest at the time? So somebody, maybe probably was James or somebody, sort of says to you, what about this project? This is the kind of broad outlays. What do you think was your motivation, your interest? Why did you decide to get involved?
Well, I was very much interested in survey research, and I had been doing that with the other projects here at ISR, but I'd also been involved in survey research since my first days as an undergraduate at University of Chicago. I was doing interviews on a number of projects. I did coding. So, and obviously in social psychology, I was learning about some of the great surveys that have taken place. So, it interested me as a methodology. And when I started, though, I was more experimental, which I think just about everybody was who came into social here. And Bob Zients was my first, advisor. And my early projects were experimental. So this represented a shift of some sort, but reading something like Americans View Their Mental Health, I just thought that the topic and the methodology were engaging. And being in ISR. Now, our first research offices were not even in here. They were on some building down on Division.
Oh, really?
And as I recall, there was a fire there. Somebody left a coffee pot on, and some data were actually destroyed. So it made me paranoid about data from then on. We started keeping those big magnetic tapes in vaults, in banks and things, because of that incident. We thought, oh no, you can never leave your data anywhere that's that vulnerable.
Wow. Yeah, that's okay. Okay, so interesting. So what else at this time? You're finishing up your dissertation. You're interested increasingly in survey research. You have an opportunity to be part of a data collection effort. Did you have a sense of just kind of two different things? A, what the larger campus climate was like at the time. Kind of, there were a lot of things going on in the country at that time.
Yes.
And then B, within that, kind of what ISR really was. Did you have a perspective at the time, or were you just kind of plugging away, just doing it?
I thought ISR was, another NORC, RC, National Opinion Research Center, and I had, worked in a couple of different jobs there, so it just seemed like, NORC East, I guess. Right. So I didn't get a sense that it was, as significant as I came to realize it was. As for the larger social political context, I was coming out of perhaps the most turbulent 4 years in Chicago's history, maybe. With the riots that had taken place after Martin Luther King's death, the Democratic National Convention, all that was happening certainly all around me. And as a student, we actually moved out of the dormitories, kind of thinking, who knows what's going to happen right after Martin Luther King was assassinated. I was actually at a Second City performance when people started, murmuring, oh my God, what happens? So we left. And we were in Grant Park while the Democratic National Convention was going on, and there was, a police riot. We were maced. Everybody fled Grant Park onto the IC, the Illinois Central Railroad, to get home. But everybody teary, unable to see or breathe from the tear gas and the mace. After Martin Luther King's assassination, troops were parachuted, I believe, right into Chicago, and University of Chicago is located right in the middle of the South Side. I knew all those areas because I had delivered mail to all those areas in the summer. But I can recall on 2 occasions being confronted with a soldier with a rifle and a bayonet on the end, pointed directly at me. So, it was a volatile environment. You wondered how this stuff could be happening. Orangeburg, Kent State, students were getting killed in the street. The BAM strike had taken place here in 1970, the year before I came. So, there was a heightened sense of urgency about resolving racial issues, addressing racial issues. And I think that, everybody here who is a graduate student, saw themselves as an activist in some way, that your research had to be directed toward resolving some of these issues. Mm-hmm. So, the political environment was full of static. It was just a very kind of prickly, intense time. And coming into here, some of that was, ebbing to some extent. I mean, the Black Panthers were murdered still while I was in Chicago. So coming here, was out of, an intense urban environment. It felt, just a little more peaceful. But it also kind of allowed you to kind of focus, academically on, the issues that, had been concerning everybody for some time. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So it was an interesting political moment, unlike any I think we've ever had since then.
Yeah, absolutely. As you move and complete your dissertation, you're in a larger context, and you guys begin working on the proposal. Mm-hmm. What do you remember about how, just the kind of time that was spent working on the proposal?
Well, I have to tell you, when you were working in ISR, you were working on proposals night and day. I mean, that's all you did, work on the proposals, right? Mm-hmm. Everybody was submitting proposals all the time. Right. I don't know that I had the sense that this was going to be something that was, earth-shattering, that it would change the way we do things. I don't think any of us had that sense at all. Mm-hmm. This was the next proposal. Mm-hmm. Now, it had some potential, more money than some of the other proposals, doing some things that we had never gotten a chance to do. I mean, we knew that what we were proposing was revolutionary. Mm-hmm. Nobody had ever done this before. Mm-hmm. I was a little unprepared, I think, for the opposition here in ISR, mm-hmm. that so many people thought that this was, untenable, that it was, wrong methodologically, mm-hmm. That, the white control group was such a dominant paradigm. So, focusing on any single racial group was just, anathema. I had not realized the extent to which, people had invested in that paradigm until, they were responding to, I think, even the proposal itself. I'm not sure, when James was called before, this group to defend. I'm not sure if that was before, because you really had to kind of vet a proposal before it got out of here. I mean, you couldn't just, submit on your own. It had to go through an internal process too. And I don't know when this happened, but I actually became a member of the executive committee for the Survey Research Center.
Oh, wow.
So I was probably the youngest person in history. I think I was 26. I was certainly, maybe the only, well, of course, the only person of color. There weren't even women on there. So somehow, and they would do all their retirement modeling based on me. This is like, the worst case scenario, what we'd have to pay out. But, I was on the committee when we proposed doing the first wing of ISR. And, no other entity, I think, in the country, had the kind of autonomy that we did, getting back all of our own overhead. You could actually talk about building wings.
Right.
Even now, I mean, nobody else can do that. Right?
Right. It's true.
So I got that experience of seeing how this place is run. We went over all the publishing, the publications reports, all the financial reports. I saw what was happening with all the projects, and I knew there were other projects in deficit that we covered. So, when the issue about, PRBA being in deficit became such a big thing, I'm thinking, come on, I know, they're paying the deficits for the, the consumer sentiment study or this study or that study. I know this. I know how much is being paid out. This is not, that dramatic by comparison. But having that kind of inside view, was very useful to me.
Absolutely, absolutely. That's. I certainly had no idea about that. So you're working on the NSBA proposal along with other proposals.
Yes.
And although you maybe have a special place in your heart for the NSBA proposal, you're not necessarily clear about, what's going to really happen next. I mean,
no, I was working on this other project with Libby Devon and some others here. It was a women's drug project, and we had gotten significant funding from the National Institute of Drug Abuse. And, we were looking at these drug abuse clinics in New York, Miami, Los Angeles, and Detroit. So that was my, everyday focus. This proposal I was doing, on the side, but, every day we had to collect data. And that was an interesting experience because, the relationships between, the drug abuse treatment personnel and, the evaluators that we had to be were a little tense. And even though it was all, for the most part, women working on this project, I can remember one meeting where actually people came to blows.
Wow.
I mean, people, it was intense, right? It was a totally different kind of research experience where, kind of real life came up against, academic life. And we had, we actually had a contract with UCLA. I never imagined that I was going to end up being there. And one of the research assistants actually was fudging data. And we had, some ex-addict interviewers. It wasn't the ex-addicts, it was, the students, right, white students who ended up, causing us so much grief, just making up data. So that was what I was dealing with on a day-to-day basis, that crazy project.
Right. So let me just get, so first thing is, in the last 2 days, I've heard about more violence associated with survey research than I would have ever imagined.
Yes.
Anyway.
More than is known, widely known, right?
Time.
Yes.
But as far as you're kind of concerned, what you're doing at this time is, again, working on your dissertation.
Yes, but I had
collecting this
finished.
data. Okay.
I finished in December of '75, so that was done.
Okay.
Right.
Okay. So you're done, and you're technically a research scientist at?
Yeah, I think.
whatever the
Yeah,
name was
right.
at that
I've
time.
forgotten exactly what the name was. Yes,
But
in
your
my
primary affiliation was with ISR.
my primary affiliation was with ISR, and I had also some kind of title with psychology, some
Okay.
affiliate or something. But
Okay.
I was was it a project director, or I've forgotten exactly what the name was, but whatever we were called then, I think it was assistant research scientist, something like that, yes. So I was a primary full-time ISR employee by the time we were actually working on that proposal.
Got it. And do you recall, I think Phil at that time was still a graduate student, or when he had...
No, he told me when he actually finished, but he said that yesterday, and I wasn't quite sure about when anybody actually finished.
Because they just kind of...
Yeah, because you just kind of morphed into these other roles. Because I was working on many of these projects before I finished. Right. I started working on that drug abuse study. Right. Beth Reed was was one of the PIs, and do you remember Harvey Reed, who was a faculty member here some time ago? But she was his wife. She was from social work, and so there was a loose team. ISR was doing, the evaluation component. I guess social work was also working on some of the clinical work too. But so that was, a primary occupation, and that went on for 3 or 4 years. But we were always on the side, writing other proposals, and the NSBA was one of those other side proposals. So you had to be an entrepreneur, a hustler, and which served me well for the job I eventually had at UCLA, working as a faculty member in psychiatry there. There is a similar model. You have some core support for your faculty position, but you also have to generate money. So, what I learned here was invaluable for what I had to do later in life.
Absolutely. So, okay. So you are doing a little bit of everything.
Yeah. Like everybody else.
Like a
journeyman. Yes.
It's a crazy. It's really, when I think now about, so for example, I met Phil as an undergrad, and so Phil, of course, was very inspirational for me as an undergrad. And I began early with SROP and started analyzing NSBA data.
Yes.
And so, as you know, Phil, I joke now, he was the director of the Institute for Social Research, director of the Institute for Research on Race and Public Policy at UIC. And I was an RA there, and I also did SRLP, so he had a little office for me there.
Yeah.
And so I'd be in there working, and he would come in and start talking.
Yes.
So I joke and say that my BA in African American Studies is really subtitled Conversations with Phil, because I learned so much about it. And so I had a sense of his intellect and charisma and just kind of power.
Yes.
And now coming up here for the year, I'd heard so much about the legacy coming up here for the year, and getting a sense of James.
Yeah.
And I'm getting a sense of you now. And this was 30 years ago.
Yes.
So the kind of energy that you guys have now, I can only imagine how you guys were playing off of each other.
Actually it's 40, almost 35. Yeah. Right. Well, it was a dynamic time. Now there wasn't, quite so many of us here. Really, there were relatively few, and we were kind of concentrated in, different projects and floors, but, this is not, a hotbed of racial research. This was a kind of unique direction. Pat and Jerry obviously had projects that were race related, and that high school project, certainly had a component of that, but it didn't have, we didn't have the volume of research that is taking place now. We didn't have the array of researchers. I don't think, I may have been the only Black study director, could be. There were, very, very few of us. So you were kind of staking out new territory and having to combat, the traditional ways of doing things, right?
Absolutely.
Like the typical interviewer, in fact, you were taught this in survey research courses, the ideal interviewer was a retired, school teacher who would have been, an older white woman, right? So we were, trying something new and, meeting resistance. in a lot of places. I mean, Jerry talks about ISR stepping up, and eventually, they did in many ways, but initially it was a lot of resistance.
Yeah. Yeah. So, so by hook or crook, you guys sort of get the proposal off, and you go back to business as usual.
Now we have to include, though, the Apple Mountain celebration.
Okay, you have to
that is a real marker for me.
So tell us about that.
We finish at 2 a.m. and we go over to Cottage Inn, and I don't know why Apple Mountain, was the agenda item, but we thought, well, how else can we celebrate?
Right.
And it was a legendary dessert, I guess, and I remember Jerry and James. I don't know if there were others there, too. I can't remember, but I do remember all of us digging in, eating that Apple Mountain. And that became like the symbol of completion for me.
Did that turn into any kind of, did you guys...
A tradition?
Yeah.
I don't think we did, but we always kind of held it out as that moment, that signal moment, when we kind of knew we could relax and just, wait, right. I guess. But, it was a certain kind of, victory lap. Yeah, we did it. Yeah. Now we can have some Apple Mountain. I was, in good shape, then running. And seriously, then I could run that 15 miler in under 2 hours.
Oh, goodness.
Yes, I still have, my... I don't know if I was third place, maybe. I got a trophy. I know for running it in later years. I mean, we helped found it, that race.
Oh, wow.
I was in the Ann Arbor Track Club when we decided, I don't know who made the decision. Elmo Morales was the director, and I hear he's still the director, to have this 15-mile race run from Dexter to Ann Arbor. Okay. So I could eat an Apple Mountain then, right?
So you were an avid runner through graduate school?
Well, it wasn't through. I started in graduate school. It wasn't immediate, but through much of graduate school and afterwards when I was working here, I was a runner.
Okay, and would you just run in the mornings before you worked, or was it any kind that regular? Or?
Well, because of the weather here, we had to do different things, and everybody would kind of gather at. There was a track, an indoor track, where we ran it. I don't know if it still exists, but there were a lot of really good athletes. In fact, and this is kind of a real signature moment, Hazley Crawford, he's Trinidadian, and I had some Trinidadian friends here. He lived here and trained here. He was training for the Olympics, and he was representing Trinidad. The 1976 Olympics were held in Montreal. So I went, with my boyfriend at the time, but we went to Montreal, and I actually saw somebody in what was called then Scalper's Alley who had tickets. And I asked, what event they were for, and they were actually for the event that included the 100. I said, how much are they? And he said, I'll give them to you at face value if you don't sell them. Turned out they were on the finish line of the 100.
Oh my goodness.
Right on the finish line. So go to the event. Hazley wins. He won the 100. So, I saw him every day. I'd go to that track and run 5 miles a day, and on weekends I'd run 10 miles. And see Hazley, and Hazley be kind of joking around and, working out. I'm not sure that any of us thought he was actually going to win, but he was the fastest man on the planet here in Ann Arbor. So he was just one of a number of really fine athletes who were training in Ann Arbor at the time. So hanging out, that's what I did in the evenings. I would hang out at the running facility and run during the winter when you couldn't go outside, and the rest of the year I'd run on trails, on Huron Parkway. I lived in Trever Glen, I guess it was, the apartment complex on North Campus, and I'd run all those trails out there.
Wow. Okay. So, I'm also a runner. So
oh, really? Yes.
I think it's a great activity. So you eventually hear back about the proposal, unless we've.
Yes.
Okay. So you hear about the proposal. What happens then?
goodness. Well, it had to be staffed up. I mean, I don't even remember. James would remember these details, of course, as a still a fledgling researcher here. I certainly wasn't involved in negotiating the budget. So I don't know. I doubt that they gave us, what we asked, So there was some planning, hiring, and it was, an elongated period of development. And, I'm not even sure exactly how we went about hiring folks, but, more and more people got involved, and we started working on, questionnaire development.
Right.
I mean, that was the main thing, as well as sampling. I mean, that was the other main thing, because nobody had, the sample had to be developed from scratch.
Right. So why don't you tell us a little bit about both of those, about the questionnaire development and about the sampling stuff, whatever you recall.
Well, people were given primary responsibility for different sections, obviously, help seeking. Section F was Woody's.
Yeah.
Phil worked on the economic section. I was working on social support and family. I'm not sure who had primary responsibility for identity, but
It was Wayne.
Wayne, yes, that's right. It was Wayne. And so, people assumed primary responsibility, but did not work, only on those. Some of mine section was informed by what we were doing on the women's drug abuse study. And other people, we'd have group meetings to talk about these various sections. And, it was a long process that, sometimes things did get a little tense because, you only have so much time and you only have so much space. So, pre-testing all of these ideas, and, a lot of these notions were, I suppose, half-baked, from the from the perspective of the field. We were trying out new constructs, new concepts, and new procedures, like, the back translation, used for this purpose. It hadn't really been used for this purpose before. And that was, James's notion. We got to figure out whether or not these constructs make sense. You can't talk about social support with folks at large. You can't even use the term significant other. You really got to find a way of talking about constructs that are meaningful within, the social science field with, regular people, right? And regular people who weren't middle-class whites.
Right.
So that was, a long, very, very difficult process. And if we had, 10 years of age on us and, 10 or 20 years of development, I'm sure things would have been done in a very different way. But, it was what we had at the time.
Yeah.
And, it was absolutely all-consuming. I can remember, when I really decided, maybe it was time to leave and strike out, for something else. Your life really was nothing but this project. And I remember one Thanksgiving Eve at midnight, I was standing in line at the copy machine. And I remember thinking, this is Thanksgiving Eve, and there are this many people here at midnight that I have to stand in line for the copy machine. Wow. I thought, I'm not sure this is a life, But that's what it was. It was completely all-consuming. Yeah. Going down to Montgomery, Alabama to do the pretest. We did absolutely everything ourselves. We typed up the questionnaire, we drew the boxes, drew the arrows, copied them, put the covers on them, boxed them up, send them down, and I'm not even sure if we flew or drove down to Montgomery. We were driving everywhere, right? So it was, we did everything, trained the interviewers, worked with them. We did absolutely everything ourselves. You could not rely on the field section to do anything. So that made it way more expensive, way more time consuming, but we absolutely learned every aspect of survey research. And then Shirley, leading the sampling efforts, actually, chunking out, scouting the sectors. She was doing everything, absolutely everything, right?
So I think you mentioned yesterday, it was kind of funny that you called a meeting that was supposed to start at 2 a.m.
Yes, because this was in the final stage. We had to get this thing complete. We knew we didn't have any more days. We knew when we had to go to the field, and we knew we had to finish these instruments. And there were still a lot of decisions to make about what had to be cut, whether or not certain questions worked. So we were working 24/7, round the clock. So, 2 a.m. was the only time we had for Section F. And, he could go, he had a family, he could go home and get some sleep and, come back. But, we were just like, every meeting was lined up. Yeah, Section F was 2 a.m., but I'm sure that wasn't the last meeting. It certainly wasn't the first meeting, right? Yeah, there was no other way to do it except, to meet 24/7. And as I said, at some point, James absolutely collapsed. He had to go to the hospital. He collapsed from exhaustion, completely collapsed. And people were, sleeping on the floor, and I remember, Paul Timmer, he was, young white, our typist, and he was, so supportive. Remember, no computers. Right. So every change, you had to type up that thing again. And I still recall him stretched out on the floor, just trying to get a little bit of rest, right, before, the next change, right? But it was definitely 24/7.
And so, what do you think was really driving you at that time?
I know we had a sense of mission. Like this was, by then, this was past proposal time. This was actually, do it time. So we all had the sense, especially given the opposition, that we had to do it and it had to be successful to prove, all these critics wrong. So there was definitely a sense of mission and purpose. And it was going to be looking at something that nobody had looked at. So, yeah, you had to prove, a lot of people wrong. And it had to be done, and it had to be done on time. We only had so much time. And when I think about, 3 years, it wasn't even 5 years. A lot of these projects these days would have been 5 years. But this was 3 years. And it was, a difficult thing to pull off. And, was I positive that we were going to pull it off? I'm sure nobody was positive, but, we were putting in the effort, that's for sure.
Right, absolutely, absolutely. Again, just thinking about what I know of the personalities involved today.
Yeah, all of them are, everybody's driven, right? Yeah. Everybody was certainly a driven personality, right? You couldn't have anybody on that project who was not driven, right?
Well, not only driven, but insanely driven. Just absolutely possessed by this project. Anyway, so it would seem that, so you guys are working not only in terms of doing the actual work, but there's a fair amount of innovation that is also occurring during this time.
Right. And I think, as is said, necessity is the mother of invention. The innovation was because we didn't have any choice. So it wasn't that people struck out to develop, new methodologies necessarily. You discovered that, what was at hand didn't work, so you had to find a new way.
Right.
I think, that's really what it was.
Yeah, gotcha. So, you guys, the study kind of goes into the field about 78, 79.
Yes. In 78, we were doing pre-testing.
Okay.
Right? And that was probably, I did not go into the field for the full thing because I had left by then, but in 78, we were doing pre-testing. I was fully involved in that down in Montgomery and in Detroit.
Okay. All right. So what do you remember from the pre-testing trips?
Well, trying to launch something in Montgomery, Alabama was interesting.
Yes.
Right. And I'm trying, I get these trips confused sometimes because I was also working with this, I was on drug abuse IRGs and got involved in this national evaluation project where they'd send in teams of evaluators. And at one point, I had to go to Alabama for that. And I do remember our sense that this is a different racial environment, so we've got to operate differently. I remember even feeling, that going into establishments was just a little different. And with that team, and I'm not sure if it was before we actually did our research or our pretest down there or not, I had to go with this evaluation team. They put us in a Days Inn on this back road somewhere, and down the street was maybe a Holiday Inn where they had a lounge, and we all walked down there. Now this was an interracial team, and we walked down there just to sit in the lounge and listen to some music. And at some point we get up and dance, and I know I was dancing with another kind of white colleague on the team, and somebody did a rebel yell, and you could just see that it's time to leave. And we left, and that kind of set the tenor for me about our work there. But I don't remember a lot of the details anymore, except because we were just so engaged in the training. We had long training sessions, training the interviewers, making sure that the instruments were right, because the instruments are never right in a pretest. Never. The skip instructions, making sure that they work properly. And this was a fairly complex questionnaire. The go-tos, are they going to the right place? So we were so caught up in making sure that those things were working correctly that I don't remember a lot of the social context. And it's amazing that that memory is gone. But what I remember most is process and just trying to get the work done.
So you guys went out into the field to do the testing, the question testing and stuff. How did you find folks to participate?
Now, it must have been Shirley's job to get some of those, because we had to do, some kind of random sampling down there. And I wasn't involved on that part of it, but I'm sure that, because Shirley was down there on that trip, that we had left that job to Shirley, who was the sampler extraordinaire.
Okay, got it. So you're still the primary crew, right?
Yes.
And a number of you guys are going out to do piloting and testing of the questions. You learn some things, both about America and
Yes.
the survey, and you come back to revise. What happens next?
That was probably around the time that I had decided to leave to move to California. I just, the work intensity, the weather, this is the third straight winter of record cold and record snow. So I decided I had to get out of there. I was still on the advisory panel, and I would still come back, but I was not as involved after that point, after September '78, in the day-to-day operations. I was still very invested in the questionnaire and getting things done, but I had decided it was probably time for me to go. That maybe if I was going to develop more as a scientist, kind of outside of this thing, I probably needed to go elsewhere to do that.
Yeah. So what was the attraction of UCLA? How did you find out about it? What are some of the...
I had first, we had another graduate student named Hal Fairchild who had gotten a job at UCLA. He told me about a faculty job there. But when I went out, actually, no, I hadn't gone out there yet. I heard about a faculty position in psychology, and I was not all that interested in the faculty position, really. Then I heard that the Center for Afro-American Studies at UCLA was actually looking for a research director, and it was run by an anthropologist named Claudia Mitchell-Kernan, who had done some, pretty groundbreaking work in linguistic anthropology, even though that was not, what I wanted to do. But I went out there and met with her and thought, we could really do some really interesting research here. Try to take that in another direction. Now, when I actually got there and started to work, I certainly missed the infrastructure of an ISR.
Oh, yeah.
And there were a lot of people from Michigan at UCLA at the time. And somebody had started a petition to try to bring what was then called the MTS, Michigan Terminal System. It was really an advanced computer system to UCLA, because what UCLA had was, so antiquated in our view.
Okay.
I mean, you still had to you write job control language. Here, with the Michigan internal system, you didn't. All of that was embedded. Why should somebody be reinventing the wheel every time they submit a job? And jobs were still being submitted by cards, which people don't even. I kept them to use in my survey research classes, because people have no. And I said, why is a line 72? Well, there were these cards, and I said, what?
Right, absolutely. I mean, one of the things I remember hearing in some of my so Phil introduced me to a guy by the name of Tyrone Foreman, and Tyrone Foreman became my chair, and then he became my co-chair, because then he went to Emory, and Maria Creason became my other co-chair, and both of them got PhDs from here, and both of them had different kinds of affiliations with the ISR.
Yes.
And so, anyway, I say that to say that Tyrone one time told me that, the advances in computing is great, and the software stuff is great. It makes things a lot more accessible and doable. But one of the advantages of the card system is that, given the time it took to design them and get the data back, you really thought about your models.
Oh, yeah.
Much more carefully. People today just kind of willy-nilly a little bit, but the kind of attention to detail and things that were really required at that moment in the science, in some ways had some positive effect.
Well, and you kind of had a different understanding, a deeper understanding of certain procedures, like a chi-square, when you had to do it by hand.
Right.
You knew what a chi-square was. An ANOVA, when you were doing it by hand, you really knew what it was, right? If you just type in the word ANOVA, you don't get the same sense, right?
Absolutely.
So, yeah, you definitely, I mean, it was truly hands-on. You knew, every line. And, when I think back, a research enterprise was a lot noisier. Now it's perfectly quiet. And I can remember, during the period of transition, I mean, because you had people typing up cards, and that was like a roar, The typewriters themselves, were constantly going. So you entered a bay, all you heard was, the noise, the card punching machine, maybe if you had one in there, the type, the typing, the typewriters, like maybe you see an old movie in a newsroom, and all the typewriters are going. So they were really noisy places. And that's, one significant change, how everything is now kind of quiet, right? You don't hear the evidence of working that you used to.
Right. And sometimes people aren't working.
Right,
sometimes
exactly.
People on the internet.
Yes, right, exactly. You couldn't do that then. You couldn't be searching for something else. No, you couldn't do that then. People would know if you're working or not. If that typewriter's going, you're working, I guess. Right? If you're reading, maybe. Right.
Sure. So you find out about a possibility of being a research director.
Yes.
In the Center of Afro-American Studies.
Right.
At UCLA.
Yes.
And anything in particular that's happening for you during that transition moment? Any particular?
Well, we always maintained our connections. So I was still writing with folks here, writing with Robert Taylor, for example, writing with Phil and James. I mean, we were still writing. Now, it was a lot harder then because you couldn't just send a paper over the internet.
That's right.
Right. I mean, you're sending drafts back and forth through the mail. Right. I mean, imagine that. I know, it's almost impossible to imagine. Yeah. But everything, I mean, you sent off a proposal by hand. Right. You'd have to send in like 10 copies. Right. And we were flying people from ISR sometimes to Washington if we had any doubt that a proposal was going to get in. Right. I know I was asked to do it once when one of these major RFPs came out, and ISR was applying along with maybe Mathematica and some of these other major institutions. And it had to go to, of all places, Columbus, Ohio. And I remember the director coming to me at some point saying, can you fly it in, right? Because you couldn't just put anybody in charge of these things either. I mean, it's like the life of the institution in this box, and you couldn't let anybody handle it. You had to take it, right? So it was crazy making in those days, just trying to meet deadlines. But writing papers, whatever. It was a long, slow process, a more deliberative process, certainly, because you're not just like typing a line and having it go through the ether.
There's so there's a motivation to be careful.
Yeah.
And be thorough.
Right.
Because once you put it in the mail, you can't then, with email, you say, oops, no, here's a new one.
Right, ignore that.
But mail, it's
right.
like, oh, man, now the whole thing is set into motion in a certain way.
Right.
So, but you guys are still collaborating.
Oh, yes. We see. And in fact, there's somebody coming in the door. I don't know if you want to stop it.
No, we don't have to.
Okay. We still collaborated. And I started off on another direction. I started looking at marriage. And I got a Research Scientist Development Award, one of the Career Development Awards. I actually ended up getting 2 of those to do that kind of work.
Which
NIMH.
Okay.
NIMH first, and then the second one was, were they both NIMH? One was maybe combined because my research was being funded by NIMH and NICHD. I started looking at marital dynamics, but really what were the causes and consequences of marital decline in African American populations in particular. But I actually launched a national survey, 21-city survey, looking at blacks, Latinos, and whites in those cities to kind of look at marital patterns, and I used ISR as my survey outfit.
Okay.
Right. So I continue the relationship.
UCLA, you sort of had at least one project, if not more, that kind of
right.
went
There were
through.
2 projects, yes, who went through here.
Okay.
Right. And so I continued to do survey research. We, did, a survey of the entire island of Jamaica, looking at, AIDS issues. And
now, what year was that?
that was in the early 90s.
Yeah. And so
Gail Wyatt was the PI. I was a co-PI, and Claudia Mitchell-Kernan was a co-PI, and some other investigators down at the University of West Indies were also co-PIs on those AIDS projects. We worked with University of West Indies in Mona. So, I still continued to do survey research. I was teaching survey research there. And I actually became a professor at UCLA. I was a research, what they call assistant research psychologist at UCLA through the 80s. And then the person who hired me actually became vice chancellor for graduate programs at UCLA. And then I became director, at least temporarily, of the Afro Center then. The Afro-American Studies Research Center. And there are research centers there, those ethnic centers. There were also degree programs that were developed later, but by the centers, these research centers that were set up. And we actually had FTE, so we could make faculty hirings around campus.
Oh, wow, okay.
Right.
So just want to make sure. So one thing, I definitely want to follow up with you about this Jamaica study because I'm very much interested in survey research in the African diaspora. And one of the things that we need to think a lot about as we turn to doing another kind of survey is really making sure that we learn from all of the different efforts that have taken place. And I know there's a lot of information that we can glean, a lot of lessons learned from the NSAL and the Jamaica Guyana surveys done here.
Yes.
We want to make sure that we bring into the fold all of the studies that were that can help us learn. Because doing the work in Jamaica is a lot different than doing the work in the States.
Very different. And we actually ended up working with the people who do the census down there. To try to, because there had been a hurricane, so all the sampling that even the census down there had done was everything had to be redone.
Yeah, see that's
because the dwellings were gone. Right, a whole different kind of operation.
So okay, so there's a lot here. So you find out about a I'm just so you find out about a research director position at the Center for Afro American Studies
Right.
at UCLA. You make the move. Do but you correct me here. It seems like you don't take that position initially, or you do.
I did, right. I
Okay.
started in September of 78.
Okay, so you take that position. You're collaborating here.
Yes.
And you are also taking on a full new trajectory at
Yeah.
UCLA. So tell us a little bit about how that developed. So you said you did the marriage study.
Right, now
I'm
that-
trying to see how these things.
We had tried to get funding for, some kind of more kind of community-oriented studies, and were unsuccessful. But, and I'm trying to remember, this was in the late 80s that I got funding to do kind of a pilot study. And I looked at census data just to document that, there was marital decline. And I was also looking at the relationship between sex ratio and marital decline. That was the primary focus. And I called a meeting in 1989 in LA, kind of a focused small meeting, but I had a number of people from here. James was involved, Phil Bowman was involved, Joe Veroff was involved. I don't know if Libby was involved or not, but I brought, and Shirley Hatchett was involved, and I brought a number of those people out. And that became that book that we did on marital decline. That ended up being published in '95. I mean, but that first meeting kind of launched the effort. And that book has been used in a lot of classes around the country. Still, I'm shocked to see, given how old it is, because there at the time, there's no other discussion of that. So that became my research focus, for a significant amount of time. I mean, I've done other things there, got involved in other research projects, but that was kind of my primary intellectual focus.
Okay.
And I had, 2 research projects funded from NIMH and NICHD to fund that, and 2 a Research Scientist Development Award and what was the other one called? Another one of those Research Scientist Awards.
Okay. And your full and primary appointment at UCLA is in the Afro American Studies Department, or do you also have other affiliations?
Today? At the time?
Yeah.
At the time, it was full time in the Afro Am for, I don't know if it was 6 or 7 years, until I got that first Research Scientist Development Award. And then that made my primary appointment in psychology as as a researcher, because it had to be in a mental health department for that award. I maintained an appointment in Afro-Am and was director through 1991. But in 1990, I got a full-time faculty position in the Psychiatry and Biobehavioral Sciences Department, which was also then an appointment in the Neuropsychiatric Institute.
Oh, wow.
So that's where I moved in 1990. Yeah.
Wow. Okay. So, and so during this time, I'm sure you're, still working just as hard as you had ever worked.
Only with kids. That made it a little different.
Okay.
Right.
Right. That's true. Did you were you in dialogue with folks back here?
Oh
with
yeah.
respect to-
I think I was always in dialogue with folks here. I mean, I don't think there was ever a time in my career that I never talked to folks. So I was always in touch, and we were, writing papers. In one paper with Robert and Linda, we used data from this project, but also data from one of my projects there. Some qualitative data from a project there where we looked at, romantic attitudes among the elderly. And that became, I was just mentioning to Robert yesterday, a heavily cited paper. I had people actually writing me, thanking me for that article, because it put elderly, now I wouldn't even call them elderly, that's older people, in a different light. It was about agency. Because, older women, one of our findings was that older women, they said that they weren't interested in relationships. And somebody might interpret this as sour grapes. Well, who would be interested in an older woman anyway? But no, it was about their realizing that many of the men that they might be attracted to them were really kind of older and infirm and maybe looking for a nursemaid. They wanted economic independence. They were kind of tired of being responsible for families. So it was about, a relationship would complicate their lives and perhaps even be a drag on their lives. They wanted to live, free of burdensome entanglements. And that was only possible through combining the survey research with some more qualitative interviews with people. That gave us a different kind of insight. So we would be able to kind of combine forces.
Absolutely. So it sounds like, there's a lot going on. Throughout the 80s, really, there was a lot of analysis going on the NSBA. You were collaborating on NSBA and mixing in other things while simultaneously negotiating UCLA and working there, teaching survey research. And to what extent did you have a perspective on kind of the development of the NSAL, or did you have many conversations?
Well, I was on the advisory board.
Okay.
But, I wasn't, involved in the kind of the nitty-gritty details. I would, certainly come to the meetings and talk about, some of the conceptual issues. And, that project has always had, an active advisory board. So, there were regular meetings at that point, through the 90s, I would think. And interestingly enough, I became involved in this other effort in the 2000s, the Family Research Consortium. And the Family Research Consortium for the first 10 years was really, run by, white academics, and I think initially even psychiatrists. By the third generation, a group of people wanted to focus it more on race and ethnicity. And those were Linda Burton, who was at Penn State at the time, sociologist, and David Takeuchi, David, who's, became a good buddy of mine, because he actually came to UCLA, too.
Yes.
Right. And Linda became the new director. So it was based out of that third generation. It's a 5-year grant from the National Institute of Mental Health. Now, people tell me that, some of the kind of old line participants decided at that point that they didn't want to have anything more to do with it. So it was an interesting set of dynamics, even if they're going to focus on race and ethnicity. So I became involved, not in the very first year, but later. I actually was asked to be one of the faculty members because they had faculty all over the country. And for the fourth generation, I actually became director. So
what time period?
That was about 2004, I think, or 5. Maybe it was 2004. And they also had a postdoctoral component. So we had postdocs. And every program did it different. Every generation did it differently. But when I did it, we brought everybody together. Everybody was based somewhere with one of our faculty. And we had faculty from all over the country, but Woody was one of my faculty members. Right. David Takeuchi was, Maggie Alegria, at Harvard, who's, friends with a lot of folks here. I had, it was a really good kind of collection of people. And we brought people together for meetings. You have a summer institute every summer, and then also a postdoctoral training institute. So we bring the postdocs together twice a year, but then they'd be based, wherever. Vonnie was one of my faculty, Vonnie McLeod.
Wow.
Yeah. So it was, another opportunity for us to kind of get together again.
Right.
We had our first meeting in San Juan, Puerto Rico, I decided I was going to challenge people by having meetings in places where they now, that maybe they didn't fit in completely, but they would be, new opportunities for people to explore, outside of themselves. So that's why I said San Juan. And for the first one, and people said, "Oh my God, they don't speak English there." Loosen up.
Right.
And we always had really nice places for the meetings. The second one we had in Spokane, of all places. No, the second one was in New Orleans.
Okay. Oh, yeah.
Right before Katrina. That was 2005, right before Katrina.
Okay.
2 months.
Oh, wow.
Then we went to Spokane, then we went to Durham, and then we went back to New Orleans for the last one. And in fact, before the last one, instead of having a pre-con, we worked with Habitat and helped build houses.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so
Wow.
it was just, a fantastic experience. And, I could reconnect, with Woody and, and and Vonnie and, so, I guess the Michigan experience ended up becoming, for those of us, I think, who, entered at that point, a lifelong family. So, people would at every opportunity kind of bring people back into the fold, bring people into efforts that you were involved in. So every major effort I've ever been involved in has involved, to some extent, folks that I bonded with early here at Michigan.
So use that term family. So one of the things that's really interesting about this working group is there seemed to be no real line between people's families and the work, and no real line between things people did. I mean, so for example, there were some jokes yesterday about like the basketball team or whatever.
Yeah.
And I hear there are also various other athletic efforts. I also hear about the parties that took place. If you could talk a little bit about how you think that wider integration may have helped to create a long-term professional relationship, but also maybe improved the quality of the work over the time.
Well, I think, if you have a sense that you trust the people around you, and that they're always going to, help you make things better. And I think, usually that's what happened. People were advisors, counselors, and colleagues. That it set up, I guess, the conditions for a more successful working relationship. I mean, I can tell you that, that's rarely the case, outside of here, at least I find. I mean, I had some very productive and close working relationships at UCLA, but, there's nothing like this extensive family. And then it's impractical in some cities. LA, everybody lives someplace else, right? So you don't have this geographic focus as well as the, ability to get places quickly. I could get here for an interview quickly. I mean, it doesn't happen in LA.
Right.
So the conditions are not ripe for that kind of thing. They wouldn't be, ripe for that kind of thing in a lot of other universities. It wouldn't be the case at USC or, many other places, or maybe even in Seattle and Washington.
Or even in New York.
Well, certainly not, right, in New York. So, having, a compact environment, I think, does help. I mean, even Woody and Wayne, they don't live next door, but they're still readily accessible, right? I mean, you're still not talking about more than 15 minutes, maybe, right? So, and you can still out, right? Exactly. So that allows you to, to develop bonds. I think that would be almost impossible in another kind of setting. I think, it's possible in any small university, but, that's also not true generally, probably in other projects here at Michigan even. I don't know that, that people in engineering, develop these kinds of relationships. I think it was unique to this group because it was also, safe haven. You've heard that term used in, some educational research. So people could escape, the travails of the broader society by, coming together. I mean, even within ISR, there was distrust, so, you couldn't develop those same kinds of relationships, although, I think it was also critical that people like Pat and Jerry were so supportive of this group and were, intricately involved in the group. So yeah, it's that sense of family, I think, was a critical component, because I've seen other projects kind of blow up
around these kind of trust and interpersonal.
I know of other seemingly successful programs at other small university settings where things devolved into really conflict-ridden places. It's it has not worked in a whole lot of places. So I think it was James's leadership, certainly, and also the leadership of the succession of people who came after him, like Robert and Linda. They're kind of mellow people. Woody, the personalities were conducive, I think, to that kind of relationship developing.
So now it's 2014.
Yeah.
And the world is very different, and in some ways very similar. Maybe if you could talk a little bit about what you perceive to be the climate. We've got major shifts in funding apparatuses. We have pressure from University of Michigan to get a greater portion of that overhead at ISR. We have James, who's been a stalwart trying to hold them off from getting that money. And we have a PRBA that has a rich and strong history, but that is also low on cash. Right? So if you could just talk a little bit about that environment and your perspective on it, especially kind of as an outside insider.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Well, we had a meeting, was it 2 years ago, to kind of discuss these kinds of things. And, I am, as an administrator at UCLA, I'm certainly facing similar kinds of pressures. So, a significant part of my job is fundraising, but fundraising, of a different sort, not necessarily going to agencies and asking for money, but seeking out donors, talking to people with, tremendous amounts of wealth, trying to get them to invest in our operation. So I'm spending money and time, trying to, whining and dining, designing materials, it's just, crazy making, but it's, really trying to get people to give you, 50 million, 100 million, it's another kind of operation, and it's not one that I was, trained to do. I'm certainly adept at going and asking NIH or Ford for money, but, trying to get, a wealthy donor to come up off of some millions is a different kind of enterprise. But that's what we have learned that we have to do.
Right.
So, I think, trying to consider the funding streams or critique the funding streams, what's realistic, what isn't. I'm sure that PRBA will still be able to get some money from NIH, but it doesn't look like the kind of funding that was available in the past is going to be available in the future. They've kind of shifted their paradigm, unless, that paradigm can be embraced. I mean, do people really want to do brain research and, biomarkers? I don't know. To me, the biggest problems on Earth are still having to do with racial conflict. That still remains the big unsolvable uh, oppressor, right? And almost every conflict on earth is related to the failure of groups to be able to live together, or one group aggressing against another group. That still seems to me to be the biggest problem on earth, which leads to inequalities in healthcare and all the rest. And trying to convince somebody that that these efforts also inform that is a challenge. When it's not some new medical instrument or something, it's hard to get people to see that. But I don't think it's impossible, and that's kind of what I do now. I think trying to convince people that PRBA has been successful beyond anybody's expectations is something that has to be done. And I think we need to be better about documenting what has come out of this effort. All the scientists who have been produced, generationally, one group fans out from here, but they've also produced, most of the quality scientists in this country have come from this effort. And if that's not documented, who's going to know how valuable it is? I think you can get investments from donors if it's made clear, what the payoff has been and what will happen if it's not continued. So it's at this point, a sales job, I guess, and I don't think that's ever been undertaken. So I'm sure that we can do better in that regard, documenting exactly what this whole effort has produced. And it's going to be done fairly quickly because a lot of us are losing our memories, and people won't be around to give you that kind of data. I'm just trying to document, what's going on, say, with the Ethnic Studies Research Centers at UCLA, and I can't find, a whole lot of materials. Some people are uncovering some stuff and giving it to me now, but that's a major effort in and of itself, just trying to show people what has come out of this. But that's increasingly, I think, what has to be done. I think it has to continue. I don't know if, it becomes something a little broader or not. I don't know if combining, these efforts with, related efforts. I mean, certainly it's gone beyond the United States boundaries, and I think that was essential. That it ought to be some kind of more global enterprise, looking at populations around the world. I mean, there's black populations everywhere, in Russia, in China, it doesn't matter. I mean, but trying to really examine things from a variety of perspectives, not just, mental health, but, what's happening with this incredible diaspora. I think it's still a critical and needed undertaking. So I certainly want to do everything I can to make sure that, this lives on.
We're going to hold you to that.
Okay. All right. That's good. That's good.
So one of the chief impeti of, this whole reunion project is to begin to document the legacy and history of the PRBA for a wide number of reasons, but one of the reasons is in full recognition of everything you've just said, which is that among other things, people can't support things that they don't know about.
Yes.
And so I think one of the things that I really have grown to appreciate over the years about the PRBA and the people who, for one reason or another, ally themselves and give so much of their time and energy to the PRBA is a kind of serendipity among the leadership. People have ideas that are largely in sync, kind of they kind of all play off of each other in a particular way, which says to me that The project is certainly about science, certainly about intellectual acumen, methodological rigor, substantive meaning, but there's also a value kind of system there that seems to inform this kind of serendipity that comes up, that comes out of people's mouths. So, as we think about the current climate and some of the potential opportunities that are arising for creative solution making, if you were able to imagine a small cadre of young, ambitious, maybe not as crazy, but sufficiently crazy scholars, and you had you and the rest of the crew had sort of gone around and really picked these people, and you imagine yourself sort of handing a baton. What are some of the key things that you would want to say to them? What are the kernels that you really think are at the center that really need to drive their work? And as you think about your answer, you're on tape. And what we hope to do is to really keep this around. So I'm not talking about 5 or 10 years. So what are those real kernels that you really want to?
Well, I think you got to think clearly about what the needs of the population are. What is it that we need to know about, populations of African descent that can position us better to survive in this world? I mean, there's, plenty to be kind of depressed about, if you look at statistics. What is it that we can look to as areas of optimism? But trying to figure out, what the key issues are that need to be addressed. And I'm sure, these great young minds are going to come up with that. And they may not be the issues that we thought were as critical. Or what are the engines that drive this continued, oppression? I've heard about, some educational environments that seem to be, producing, wonderful. Can you duplicate that? What does it take to duplicate that? But really, I guess an action plan. I think, I don't know that we ever had an action plan. What is it that we urgently need to know? And if we know it, what steps can we take? Working much more closely perhaps with some policymakers or people with money to actually fund change. It may be, it may mean then cavorting with people that we normally have not, gone to. But, I've been interested to see how somebody like Henry Louis Gates can actually influence, the other Gates, to put money into World Health or something. That, it is possible to make these kinds of connections. But I think a more kind of directed approach. What do we need to know? What is possible in a plan to put that together, working with people who can affect change. I don't know that we can easily point to areas and say, yeah, we changed this about the world. There's information. You can put out information, but very often, it just goes down a hole. That was one of the advantages we had working in Jamaica. We worked with the Minister of Health directly. I was speaking to Ishtar, I guess, yesterday at some point, and she quoted, and maybe it was James, who said that, the Caribbean is one place where you really do have hope of changing things because you can work directly with government, and they have the power to say, okay, we're going to do X from now on. So, finding some way, maybe it's starting little, but actually, finding the capacity to change. Right. I think that is primary. But then, continuing, this group would have to, I think, develop the same level of trust and optimism. I have to say the group, for the most part, has always been, optimistic about the future, even when things looked, pretty bleak. There was an optimism and knowing that your cause is righteous, I guess, kind of helps that. But I think the other thing they need to do is kind of marshal, the resources that are held by, this group of people who benefited from involvement and holding them accountable. Putting money into the effort, whatever it takes. But, in some ways, that's what I'm trying to do at UCLA. Everybody who we've ever given a grant to, and it's been a lot of people, students, faculty members, I'm saying, in order for other people to benefit like you did, you're going to have to invest in this.
Absolutely.
Because it's not just going to happen unless you also invest.
Right.
So,
Right.
I think, it's time to ask people to give something back.
Yeah, that's among other things that you spoke to just then. I think one of the things that we're interested in is this network mapping.
Yeah.
For a lot of reasons, because I think even though, for example, organizations like the National Science Foundation have less money than they traditionally have had, they also have a different kind of mandate that they've ever had, which is an impact-based mandate.
Yeah.
And I think if we can demonstrate impact,
Yes.
we may not get large, huge sums, but we can get targeted sums
Exactly.
to do important
Exactly.
work. Also, in terms of the private stuff, I mean, certainly we're going to cut up these videos for different audiences, but there's a certain audience that will be the kind of private donation audience. And in terms of drawing upon that network, there's all kinds of resources in that network that are not only financial.
Yes. Right.
That people can provide. Okay, so I'm just trying to think if there was anything else that I wanted to hit on in there. So as we kind of wind down here, and you think about the time that you spent here very early in your career, and how that shaped you, how you've shaped it over these years. Are there any things that you think about, any stories or any moments that you'd like to share with us?
The moments, the highlights, right? Apple Mountain, right? That's a big highlight. Goodness. I mean, we bonded over so many things. I mean, now I'm just flashing on, the T-shirts we had made up with everybody's nickname on it. So mine was BT Express. I think I still have that T-shirt somewhere. We had the big black United States on it, and then our nicknames underwards, under the map. So, I think, all these little activities, probably helped kind of solidify the team and the effort. I mean, people have been through all kinds of things over these years, tragedies and accomplishments. And I always find that, there's, that people will be there to support, either, you're with accolades or with messages of support in some way. I do think that coming here meant that I got a family that many people in graduate school did not get. I mean, I have had conversations with people who went to places where they felt like they had to struggle to get through. They certainly didn't have a community, a village to support. They may have had an advisor that was supportive, and they may not have. I've seen people who had advisors who, behaved in what I find to be unimaginable ways. I mean, if you're not going to be supportive, why be an advisor? So I feel fortunate to have had that experience as the one that launched me in my career, even though I didn't, spend, my entire career here. And so I didn't have to deal with some of the winters. I still benefited greatly from that launching pad, but also, it's I think it was it Bob Kahn who talked about this convoy of support, and I think, it certainly has been a convoy of support, and I imagine it has been that way for most people. Now, there were people who were in the psychology program here who did not become involved in this effort. Some who, had experiences that, did not mirror the kinds that we had on this project. So I know that was distinctive even within that psychology experience at Michigan. But it has been, one of the most, perhaps the most valuable component of my academic career, having been here, having been a part of the effort to launch the PRBA, but more importantly, I think, having had the experience of being in a supportive group that, was always going to be there throughout my life.
Absolutely, absolutely. So, if there was anything that you felt like was uniquely challenging over the time, and right now we're talking about early PRBA over the years since, that was uniquely challenging, that you really felt like, a moment where you may have wondered, how are you going to pull through it? If you could share that with us and also share with us how you did, because clearly you did pull through it. Well, helpful.
I certainly think that, that last instrument development phase was challenging for everybody. Going around the clock certainly meant that, everybody had to get to a new level. It was incredibly challenging, and I'm sure, many people found it unacceptably challenging. And by the sheer will of the people involved, it happened. It might not have. I mean, I can't imagine that we would have failed to finish, but, it probably could have broken some people. I don't know. That was challenging. And I think the other challenging part, and probably why, I eventually left, was that, you really didn't have a life outside of this, right? I mean, I did run, but, that was like, that was mental health breaks, right? But, you really did not have a life outside of this. So if you didn't have any other focus, you were adrift, I think. So I thought, I needed to try to, launch another life because this was all-consuming, absolutely all-consuming. And I thought, could I actually spend the rest of my life here in such a hot, an all-consuming environment? And in fact, I took some of the same work habits to UCLA, and I'd work on proposals, and I'd be there all night, and people would say, "Oh my God, she must be out of her mind." Because all-nighters here were kind of normative, especially when a proposal was due, especially not having computers. There's almost no other way to get something done. I mean, you couldn't work on it at home really, because you had to be here to get the drafts in, the drafts done, the drafts to a typist. It was a different kind of work mode. And so if you weren't prepared to kind of give over your whole life to this enterprise, it was challenging because, probably your work ethic was questioned if you couldn't fully invest. Right. Oh, well, okay, you're just not committed, huh? Right. So, that was challenging.
Yeah. So, I'm thinking about the period of time. I can imagine all kinds of race-related opposition that might have occurred. We heard a little bit, for example, about the questions not being in proper English.
Yeah.
So do you remember any particular moments or slights or things like that were part of some of the challenges?
Well, I mean, I think that James probably did a good job of shielding the project from the kinds of things he was experiencing. But I think we all remember, the challenge of, how on earth can you possibly do research on the black population without having a white comparison group? I mean, that was something that stung all of us. And, certainly affected probably all of us, throughout our careers. I mean, that was something to fight. And, I think, APA, I mean, it was fighting a lot of forces to get the right to look at a group. I mean, nobody would ever challenge, looking at the white population. Right. I mean, how on earth could you challenge looking at the black population? But it was, a view of science that was, kind of corrupt when you think about it. But, that was, that stung, I think, everybody, that we aren't worthy of being studied in our own right.
Absolutely. And so there was a little bit of conversation yesterday about this notion of the comparison group.
Yes.
And given your experience and your various expertise in the area, what are your thoughts on this notion of comparison groups in today's climate?
Well, I guess I don't see that any group has to be the index. I mean, you can still look at differences among groups and then talk about any group, on its own right. I mean, I guess I just don't understand why, one group has to be, index. I mean, certainly you have to call it that in some statistical techniques, but, that doesn't have to be the defining group. So to me, I guess I don't find it to be a quandary. Every group can stand on its own. You can talk about, I mean, certainly if the purpose is to demonstrate inequality, then you have to have, the privileged group as the standard against which all are compared. But in other kinds of things, be it quality of relationships or something else, why does there have to be an index group? To me, it's unnecessary.
Yeah, sure. But during that time, it was certainly a conflict-bound proposition.
Yeah, for those who felt that nothing existed except in reference to whites.
Right.
If you say it like that, it's absurd.
Yeah.
No other group stands.
Right.
There are. The white population isn't even the most numerous population on Earth.
Right.
So why not compare whites against the Chinese? I mean, it's just kind of crazy.
Right.
Unless you're doing an analysis of inequality.
Right.
And can say, white folks have this level. But it's not, I mean, I grew up with a lot of very poor whites. I call where I grew up Northern Appalachia.
Okay.
Incredibly poor whites. And, they're not the comparison group they're talking about. They're really talking about, the middle class whites with a certain set of values that are the referent values. That the standards are the reference standards, and I guess I just reject that whole notion.
Absolutely.
And that's what we fought early on.
Absolutely. Given your experience and expertise in survey research on small and understudied populations, what do you think about today's world as a world to do survey research in? We've got response rates that look nothing like they used to.
Oh my goodness, yes,
We've got
right.
cell phones.
Yes.
We've got web-based stuff.
Yeah.
How do we study small populations in this context?
I think it is a serious challenge, and that's something that this group needs to take up. I mean, and maybe that's one of the directions that this group takes, and that is methodological solutions to dilemmas that are just make it increasingly difficult to find a quote unquote representative population. I mean, door to door is still one way to do that, if people will answer their doors, and probably in New York they don't, in my community they probably still do. But there are so many barriers to communication. I don't even know, I mean, if cell phone, I mean, people can ignore cell phones. It's going to be a challenge. And, I had read some of Bob Grove's work, a few years back when I was looking at, methodological advances, talking about, our notions of representation, have to change, in response to the fact that we're not going to get anything like 60-70% response rates. That we got to find some way to correct for that. So yeah, it's going to be methodology. And there's going to be, I would think, greater reliance on other kinds of methodologies. In my survey course, I talked about strategies, qualitative strategies that enhance survey research. So, you can find things out in small settings that you can't find out in surveys. No, you probably can't get prevalence rates or something like that. But you can interrogate other kinds of issues, I think, in small groups, and you get enough small groups, from different areas. I think you do get some insights. So, I think we're going to have to work on, methodologies that, will work for this new world, because, the telephone survey is really gone, I think, as a way to do things, wide scale door to door is probably gone. One, because it's way too expensive, and two, trying to get people to open doors these days in a lot of places is almost impossible. I mean, the last survey I did in the early 2000s, we got a good response rate, given the constraints, but we had to be really, really innovative to find people and to get people to answer. And in some places, we had to put people on the ground. It was a telephone survey, but when we didn't get, response rates that we needed, we sent people out on the ground. And we found people, like living under overpasses, who were in the sample. I mean, it was, but you had to get people on the ground, found it out. So it's a combination of techniques, I think.
Yeah. I mean, so when I was in graduate school, I worked on a study that who ended up being my dissertation advisors, Tyrone Foreman and Maria Creason, the Chicago area study, which was inspired in total by the Detroit area study. Right. Detroit area studies.
Yes.
And had the opportunity to do some focus group stuff, some door-to-door knocking. I also worked at the University of Chicago. You may know the woman, Kathy Cohen.
Oh, yeah.
Who's a political scientist there. And she was the PI of the Black Youth Study. And the Black Youth Study was her as a PI, then there were 8 graduate students, different numbers, different times, but it was very similar to what happened at the PRBA in terms of graduate students being responsible for sections, us doing some of the preliminary piloting, and it gives you a certain perspective on the strengths and the weaknesses of survey research.
Right.
And so one of the things that I think, I know I'm thinking about is, so one thing is the current version of the, I might get it wrong, the American National Election Study. Vince Hutchings is taking the lead on that, African-American political scientist. And this is the first time where they have the survey component, but all the same questions and everything also on the what used to be the knowledge networks, web-based thing. And so there's going to be a lot of information we'll be able to see about quality differences. But also moving forward, so I'm teaching this course that Phil Bowman initiated about 7 years ago, I guess, 6 or 7 years ago, where, so it's a ICPSR course, and it's on what's the name of the course? Methodological issues in quantitative research on race and ethnicity, something like that. Right. I generally just call it the race and quantitative methods course. And so we have some guest speakers coming in this year. One of them is doing big data and culture. Yes, good. How do you think about big data? And the other one is actually doing agent-based models, which is a whole nother craesi place. And so where you're actually just making up data out of whole cloth, right? Where you're you're testing theoretical scenarios by programming agent chance to interact with each other in particular ways. So, for example, a lot of racial segregation stuff has been done on this.
Yeah.
So he's using it. Anyway, so the point is that I think that there's a broad spectrum of methods that need to be considered.
Yes, definitely.
Certainly with the agent base, I think we're kind of, out there. The big data, big data is a big term. There's all kinds of data potential there, and the ways in which all these methods can inform one another, I think are certainly things that need to be considered.
Right.
As we move forward. So as we close, because I know you probably have 10,000 things to do. As we close, are there any things that you think would be, it just came to me.
Okay.
So it's a controversial issue. So feel free to not answer it. But over the years, there's become a reputation, a not so good part of the reputation of the PRBA, that it's a boys' club, that it's not as inclusive for black women as it has been for black men. Given your early leadership role and your continuing advisory and collaborating role. What are your thoughts on the role of black women in PRBA?
Well, I certainly didn't feel that initially, not at all. Shirley and I, and I'm trying to think who else was involved at that point. Certainly Pat Gurin had some involvement. We were all. We didn't feel like there was any sexism. Now, both Shirley and I left now, and I don't know if we left for the same reasons. I felt I also needed a social life outside of what was available here, and many of the men I think were married. When I think about James, Phil, Woody, I'm trying to think who Wayne, they were all married, so it was perhaps easier then to stay here and make a career. Ann Arbor, hasn't been as easy for, I think, women to adopt the lifestyle. Vonnie left for a while, and then I know she came back here. So I don't know if it's been active or it's been, circumstantial. Certainly Cleo has an important role, but I know she didn't come in on that role. Letha was very involved in the beginning, but, she didn't have an academic career at that point. She had to go away and come back. Right. So I don't think it's been intentional. I think it's probably been harder to get women here who can devote themselves to this enterprise in the same way. Because, if you do have a partner, then you got to, find some way to deal with that. I think it's just been more difficult for women in the academy, period. We certainly have some of the same ways, some of the same issues at UCLA. So I don't know that it's been intentional. I think they probably, should work on getting, more key women in these roles. If there's a younger cadre ready, poised to kind of take over, there ought to be a concentrated effort to make sure that there are significant women involvement, because I think it affects the kinds of questions you look at and how you look at the questions. So, to the extent that it's considered to be an issue, especially from people from the outside, then it's got to be dealt with.
So I do think that without discussing a causal mechanism, that it does affect the research. For example, I mentioned some of this yesterday. We have these items that were developed by David Williams et al. To study perceived discrimination in social surveys.
Yes.
One of the findings that's come out of the the perceived discrimination questions that really kind of Phil is really early on in putting those kind of questions on social surveys.
Yeah.
Is that black men consistently report more personal experience with discrimination than
Right.
black women.
So the question is, are the questions getting at the kind of discrimination that women face? Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So what we found in doing some pretty rigorous analysis of these questions is that, in fact, they do work better for black men than they do for black women, right? So the data, the questions fit the data better for black men than they do for black women. And in the more recent research, we're finding that adjusting the questions, allowing black women and men to have different loadings on these
Yes.
Underlying factors. Once you do that, at least for major life discrimination, you're looking at large, meaningful reductions. When you say major life discrimination attributed to race, which
Yeah.
is a sort of
Yeah.
work around, the entire disparity is accounted for by measurement bias. And
Wow.
so, but again, you know, the kind of thing that David was saying yesterday in terms of creating these items and making
Yeah.
sure that the items, you know, is it good to then, so we then try to create gender neutral items?
Right.
I don't think that's what we're saying. What we're
Right.
saying is, no, we just need to make sure that there's some ones that are biased in favor of the kinds of experiences that black women are more
Exactly.
likely to have. And
Right.
so, but I think that, as you say, if we have key perspectives of the black population not represented at the design table.
Yep.
Right? So even for the NSAL, we had David Williams. So we had the oversample of Afro-Caribbeans. So we had David Williams, Ishta, Govaya was a leader in that kind of thing, making sure that the perspective of the black immigrant was there. And so I think you're right that we need to ensure, you know, leadership roles for all the different kinds of key perspectives that are in the black population globally.
Yes, definitely.
So okay, so at this point, I think we are pretty much done.
Okay.
Unless there's anything else
No.
you want to throw down.
I don't think so. I think you've covered just about every piece of ground I think we could have covered. Yeah, I can't think of anything else.
Okay.
It's been enjoyable. Thank you very much.
Absolutely, thank you. Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
All right.